Hi everyone. So my name is Riva, and I believe this is the first lecture of the PIDC lecture series, and I want to talk about case evolution at WIP. And the funny name is how can you build that WIP in a way that is legal and that judges should credit. And I hope that it's not just debaters listening to this, because I do think that there's been a lot more generosity given to the amount of material whips can run, that I also think judges should be aware of, because I do think that a lot of these are actually mentioned in recent updates of not just the World's Manual, but also the recently published UADC manual. And I think it's important for everyone to know that these are fair things for a whip to do now. So the first thing I want to do is I want to ask the question of what does it mean to really build that whip? And I want to establish a clear line, what is allowed and what is not allowed. So this is the exact rule that is in the UADC manual. I just copy and pasted it. So I'll just read it out, but then uh, like we'll kind of dissect it later. So the whip cannot give new material, as no other constructive speaker can respond to them. But the whips can introduce new characterization, new responses, new framing, new analysis, so as long as these are built on material given by previous speakers. New material is anything that cannot be reasonably derived from previous speakers, so long as the ideas being developed can be clearly traced to a development in the debate, e.g., picking up on an earlier response, deepening a given substantive, following on what first or second speakers are doing, similar analytical direction of existing material, it is not considered new material. New examples, new weighing metrics, new mechanisms, and new ways to explain previously existing arguments are not considered new material and are permitted in whip speeches. That's a lot. Let's break that down. So the way I understand it is, and this is kind of like a very simple way of saying it, any significant deviation in strategy and coverage of material from two previous speakers of the team shows that there is a disconnect and probably alludes that the whip is building up their own strategy or their own way of winning the debate, which is not allowed. So the way I'd explain this is, let's say the first two speakers primarily focus on a pragmatic argument, and then suddenly at whip there's a principal argument that they try to weigh wins the debate. That is not allowed because that shows a very big deviation from from the strategy that is intended from the two previous speakers. Another way you could say it, for example, is let's say that two of the first speakers focus on X actor and really try to explain why X actor is the most important. There is no mention whatsoever of Y actor or why the Y actor is important. But suddenly Whip introduces that new thing. You can argue that it actually falls under new material and therefore it's not allowed because there's a significant deviation of the types of material that the Whip is covering. So what is allowed? I think these four are safe to assume that they're allowed, but obviously it's about the extent, right? So if you, let's say, do it too often or you do it a bit too far, then it wouldn't be allowed anymore. But assuming you do it in a reasonable extent, these four things are allowed. The first thing is clarifications of existing material, and this is important because especially when a lot of material is being introduced in debate, oftentimes mechanisms that came from first or second speaker become a bit more unclear because there's so many variables that are now at play. And so clarifications is just more of you explaining how does your analysis apply to the current debate that is happening. So that is obviously allowed. Second is adjustment to the other side's material. So simply put, if let's say your government whip, the DLO has a new argument, all responses to that new argument should be considered legal for the reason that you are just merely adjusting to the strategic direction that came from a constructive speaker from the previous team, from the opposing team. Third is highlighting specific parts of your case. So just to be clear, right, there's a difference with the example I gave because the example I gave is there is little to no mention of, let's say, a principle, but suddenly you are trying to win on a principle at whip. This is, let's say that material is given all equal coverage, then it is up for you as a whip to explain, okay, given all of these parts of the case, which one do I want to focus on and which one do I want to win the debate on? And the last is just adding new metrics and ways in which the judge can substantiate your team's claims. So let's say there's an argument, the previous speakers have like two ways to that they try to weigh. You can give like three extra ways to weigh this piece of material, should be fine. There's this thing that I hear, it's like if you're not sure, just frame it as a response. here's the problem with that. So let's assume that that actually works, which, by the way, for a lot of better judges, it will not work. It's obvious if it is new. Um, Even if you frame it as a response, that just limits the amount of impact your material has, because if the judge can only credit it as a response, then they cannot reasonably use it to make you win the debate anyway. So I personally think just be truthful and just be like, I'm giving three reasons as to why this is more likely to be true, but this is obviously in response to, and this is obviously in a counter argument against what the other side said in their DLO or the previous speaker. So that's the way that I tried to kind of address that strategy of just framing it as a response. My debate philosophy, I spelled it wrong. My debate philosophy at WIP is you just have to do what you need to do. Which is that there are so many ways you could win the debate. There are so many ways you could lose the debate. And all you have to do is minimize the cases where you lose the debate and maximize the cases where you win the debate. And this is why I think it's important for us to understand that you can build that whip, because there is no way you can meaningfully evolve the debate if you do not build, quote unquote, right? Like, how are you supposed to, for example, explain why this argument is debate winning if you're not allowed to add new weighing metrics that previously did not exist? Right? How are you supposed to, for example, sufficiently respond to the previous speaker's extension if you're not given the responsive and substantive room to deal with it? So I think that there's a lot of things that whips have to do. So you have to, for example, deal with new arguments, you have to deal with new strategic prioritizations, you have to clarify the most important parts of your case and the round, and you also have to deal with the winning conditions of the other team. All of those mean that at some point you have to be a bit more substantive than just merely destructive or merely responsive. And that's why I think it's important for us to redefine what it really means to build that whip. I will flag that strategic prioritization is not always in response, right? It could be an internal thing. So, for example, um, it is that maybe your second speaker realized this argument takes too much time to prove. It is so unintuitive. There's a possibility that a judge will not buy it. So they tell you at WIP, let's try to shift the direction towards an argument that is more intuitive, right? So new strategic prioritizations can also happen internally. And that's completely fine because that's how you know that the bit is evolving. That's how you know that teams are actually listening to one another and evaluating their cases fairly. So that's proof as to why we should allow building. The last thing I want to deal with is just this whole response versus argument thing. I think the more that I've been like whipping, the more I realize that there's actually a very, very fine line, if at all, between the both of them, right? Because when you are responding to something, you are basically giving negative reasons for why something is true. When you are building something for your argument, you're giving positive reasons for why something is true. So both have a layer of construction and building that are required for both of them to be successfully run or successfully executed. And so it's important that you don't view those things as like very black and white. Like you can have a response, but build it like an argument, right? Or you can have an argument, but it being directly responsive. So those types of hybrids, I actually think make the best forms of material in general, because it both gives reasons for why the judge should believe you and reasons why the judge should not believe the other team. So yeah, now I'll kind of go on to caveats before I give you. So I've identified, I think, five whip strategies, but I want to start with these three kind of warnings. The first is do not overdo it. As what I said, right? It you need to balance it with, for example, responses. And I will flag, right, from all of the techniques that I've shown, I think honestly you only use two at a time, maybe three, but three is like a very big question mark. And that is because it's a tool in a toolbox, right? Like if you don't need to do it, then don't do it. If it just detracts from the way that you're gonna win the debate, then don't do it. So everything needs to be about your winning strategy. And then you choose the tools that are the most compatible with that winning strategy. The second thing is building, and how it has to be strategic. What I've found is when a judge does not understand how what new thing you're bringing kind of applies or makes sense in the debate, that's when they're more likely to flag that it's building because they can't see the connection of this with existing material. For them, it is flagged as new. For them, it is flagged as like a tangent or something. So actually, when you are doing things a bit more strategically, and when you're doing things in response to, let's say, a material from another team, that's when you're less likely to be flagged as, let's say, an illegal form of whip building. Um, what is this strategy thing that I keep talking about? So strategy is, I think the best way to understand it is it has two components, right? So the first component is it is the way that your team wants to win a debate, i.e., we win. E.g., we win on pragmatics. E.g., we win on this vulnerable actor. E.g., we prove that we have the biggest short-term benefit. And then the second part of it is how you want to deal with other teams winning push. So let's say the other team has more long-term impacts. We will try to mitigate that as much as we can in terms of response. The last is the case-to-case basis. Sometimes you don't need to build to win, right? Like, and there are some speeches I've had that I'm quite proud of that I didn't really build per se as much as I typically do. Um, and it's important to note that there's no way to win a debate like a default way. And that is because not just because every debate is different, of course, but because every debate has maybe 3 to 5 issues. And in those issues, there's a different way to solve each and every one of those issues. So it's really, really hard for me to, for example, give you a default way to win a debate. And that's why it's often, speakers and lecturers say that it's always on a case to case basis because there really are a lot of things that could vary the debate and vary the winning strategy. So what I instead encourage you to do is there are maybe five, so let's say five the legal whip building strategy I'll introduce to you. You need to justify why you are using this one over the others, right? Or even just response. Why are you prioritizing not true responses over, let's say, boxing out the material type of response? So there has to be kind of an awareness internally of what is the trade-off and is that trade-off justified? Okay, so now I will go to what I assume people wanna really know is the legal whip building techniques. So I will flag that when I was making this list, I was thinking about I was thinking about it in terms of speeches. So I was thinking about the speeches that I'm the most proud of and things that I have done and things that I've developed that made it a bit easier for me to make the margin bigger at whip. So I think if you ask another speaker, they might come up with like another 5 items that are completely different from mine if they think about it differently. Mine is just really based on my experience, and that's why and I'm generally a responsive speaker. So let's say for example for another lecturer who might do the same topic, they might have a bit more weighing centric forms of building techniques, but mine really is response and flipping, and I hope that you'll see that with the techniques I'll provide. So the first is obviously because I just talked about flipping, running counter arguments. So running counter arguments, if I had to phrase it another way, is you take an opposing side's claim and you prove the converse. So, for example, the other side has this argument as to why their policy is effective, why their policy can be properly implemented. You launch a counter argument to say that actually it will not be properly implemented. It will have a lot of backlash. The government cannot be trusted. The government is corrupt, etc. So, there are 2 ways that I want to break this down. The first thing is flipping their material, right? Which is just what I said. They have an argument on effectiveness. You run a counter argument on ineffectiveness. They have an argument on benefit. You run a counter argument on how it harms the people that they want to talk about, right? So it's really just like direct opposite, equal opposite reaction. Um, so the problem with this one, so don't get me wrong, it's effective. And actually, if your goal is to deadlock, it is a very good strategy. But that's the problem. It is hard to prove why the counter argument you have doesn't just result in a deadlock. So oftentimes what this needs is you kind of need a bit of response beforehand and then you ease into the counter argument. Because if you don't do a bit of destruction first, judges will often assume that the analytical depth of both arguments are the same. So just be careful of that. The second way I think that you can run counter arguments is structurally building responses. And like if it depends on how you can look at it. Both of them can be the same, honestly, when you apply it. But the way that I kind of look at it differently instead is, um, I am proving why something is not true. Here are 3 structural reasons as to why it's not true, right? And it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. Responses and arguments, there's a very, very thin line. And if anything, it's better if you kind of combine them. So why is it that we are treating responses as if they're just as one-line assertions versus actually building them, right? Because if they have the same damage or they have the same impact as an argument, then we should build them presumably. So that's kind of the point here. You have a response, but you structurally build it as an argument, and therefore the weight is credited is often as a counter argument. Same flaws as the flipping material, they often result in deadlocks. So there needs to be a bit of work before you opt into the strategy on kind of devastating responses. Um, so that the judge sees that one team is already at a disadvantage. The second thing is bandaging the wounds, which is a dramatic way of saying that there's an attack against your case. It is about the way that you reconstruct your case to defend that attack. So there are two ways that I think you can go about this. For here, the split is more clear. The first is outright replacing. So let's say that this layer of analysis, it happens in prep. Sometimes we prep layers of analysis that aren't as strong as others. They're attacked heavily by this team. We decide, or you decide as a whip, it's gonna take too much time to, defend this. So I'm just gonna give new reasons. So basically, they take down one reason. I will give two reasons as to why it's true. So it becomes about the numbers game. The thing is here is then kind of the con here is you need to explain as to why that new piece of analysis you have, you know, um, still proves the argument to the same extent. Because oftentimes the strategy for very lazy judges, right, is they just look at the first speaker's speech when they try to figure out the constructive case of the team. If they can just, for example, knock off a piece of analysis because it is taken down, they will not look at the whip speech often for how they think the whip speech kind of replace that material. So you need to explicitly tell the judge, this is the new piece of analysis I'm giving. This, if anything, this proves the argument better. The second way that this kind of manifests is you defend what has been destroyed. So kind of the opposite. So the replacement is it takes too long to save it, let's leave it. Defend is let's defend this till the end, right? Let's rebuild it. Let's give new examples. Let's give new characterizations. We will not give up on this piece of analysis. And what I found actually is it's either replacement or defending, right? Um, what determines which one you do is actually dependent on the piece of material it is and how important it is to the case. So if it's just one layer of analysis, replace it. Honestly, it's not worth that much time. If it is a characterization that kind of defines an argument, then you need to defend that because otherwise the entire argument is gone. So it's always a trade-off of will this take too much time to do? And if it does take a lot of time, is it worth it? Like, will we really lose if I don't defend it till the death? Is the way that you should look at these things. The next is reinforcement. So this is what I think a lot of people call rebuilding. So actually, like the previous one on bandaging is rebuilding after an attack. Reinforcement is rebuilding before there was an attack that occurred, which is also the way that I'm defining it here. So, in other words, strengthening your team's material before the other side had the opportunity to attack it. And I just want to flag, right? You don't need another team to attack something for you to know that it's going to be attacked. So, there are two things that I'd like to look at. And it's actually divided by the two types you see on screen. So, preemptive reinforcements, for me, that means there's a piece of analysis or part of the case that is complex, that is unintuitive, that is a bit long-winded, that is requires so much steps, and therefore it is just very easy and very accessible for the other team to respond to it. So you can predict that there's an attack to it, primarily because it is just easy to attack it. The second is do or die reinforcements, which is that okay, so when I tried to talk about burdens, so when we talk about burdens, right, it's like things you have to do to have a clean debate, things you have to do to win a debate. So you have to define key terms, you have to talk about why your policy will work, like those basic burdens. I think the converse exists and people are not super aware of it, which is that there are burdens that you have to um do to not lose. So there are burdens to win. So burdens to win are like we have to prove that the policy is effective. There are burdens that you have to fulfill in order to not lose the debate. For example, explaining the difference between both sides, explaining why your thing matters. So things that if you do not do, you will probably lose the debate is the other way I'd phrase it. you have that, the other team also has it, right? And oftentimes, the way that these are related to one another is the other team has a burden to respond to this particular piece of material, otherwise, they lose the debate. So, for example, if there's no engagement whatsoever on the implementation of the policy, more likely than not, the team will lose the debate. So, you know that the other team will respond to this because they are more or less required to by the spirit of debate. And those types of reinforcements, because it is like a burden, right? You actually have a lot more information about it. Like you know that the other team has to respond to it in this way because otherwise they won't win the debate. And so as a result, your reinforcements can actually be more targeted and specific as opposed to preemptive reinforcement, which is often just based on, intuition. Like I think this is a bit unintuitive and therefore I have to defend it. Um both are important. Like obviously the do or dies is more important because it's about really like the pillars of your case, right? The foundations of your case. But I will say that preemptive reinforcements make it just a bit harder for the other team to respond. So even if it's not, let's say, about winning this issue, it's about making it that the time it takes for them to respond is a lot longer, which is still a win, right? Because if they focus on this piece of material, it comes at the expense of focusing on other things. So even in that case, there's still kind of a reason why you should have preemptive reinforcements. The next is contextualization. So this is the second to the last. So as the title suggests, right? There's a context and you are explaining as to why the context benefit you. So there are two ways that I see it. The first is diversion, which is like, and this requires a level of honesty with yourself and with your team. You are losing this context. So switch it. In other case, you are losing the context of the United States. So switch it to the developing world. You are losing the context of women. So switch it to African Americans, right? So the main point is the main context, quote unquote, of the debate that has been favored so far. You're explaining that no, that's not true. Here's actually the most important. Now this requires a lot of weighing because you have to explain why all of the engagement and material that came before you are secondary, and in fact the bigger context that you are talking about is more important. So when you do this, you have to supplement it with weighing. The second thing is expansion. So the way that I understand expansion is two things. The first is you are you are marginally winning this actor, and you are not sure if you can win it very clearly for all judges. Remember, it's AP, no consensus, right? So if the judges do not intuitively think you win, you probably will not win. I am not sure if I would win all of these judges, and as a result, I want to bring in new actors, new contexts, where I can probably explain why we clearly win better. So, in other words, I'm not sure. I bring in more material so that I can at least be assured that I win on these other spheres, other frames, other contexts. So that's the first one. I think the second way that I'd say it is I am losing on scale and I need to kind of win the numbers game, which is that I may be winning on the vulnerability of this one actor, but my God, is this group so small? Like, it is so hard to explain why these 100 people are more important than the millions of people from the other side. And as a result, I want to expand the reach of my policy. I want to expand the reach of my case so that more and more people are affected. So I just don't lose the numbers game that bad is the way that I'd kind of explain why expansion happens and why it does occur. Expansion is a lot more intuitively easy to do because you don't need to have so many complicated and nuanced weighing metrics. But the problem with expansion is precision. If you are not talking about each actor in each context well, the judges will not see how you do it. So this is really a battle of concision and how sharp and precise your wording is. Because if you are being very, very vague about it, they will not think you win over these other spheres. So you need to be very precise about what you're talking about, but you also need to be very efficient about it because otherwise you're going to waste so much time on this. And the last is timeline. So let's look at the policy. Let's say we look at build, 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 right? So we want to look at it in four ways. And it's the four that you see on the screen. The first is its inception. So what happened when it was initially implemented, right? What was the sentiment of the public at the time? What are the reasons? What is the rationale for having build, build, build? And then we go to the process. How did the Duterte administration, implement this policy? Was it met with resistance? Um, what are the challenges that it faced? Like with it's a process inherently. And the third is the outcome. So what did it do, right? Like did it really build infrastructure? Did it build safe and durable infrastructure? And then the last is it continuous? Did it exist for a long time? Is it so palatable as a policy that Marcos continued it? So when we're talking about policies, they have a lifespan. And for me, the way I divide that lifespan is into the four that you see in the screen. The main premise of this type of rebuilding, or this building rather, at WIP is there are four parts of that lifespan. You explain why one part of the lifespan is more important than other parts of the lifespan. Let's kind of walk you through that. This is like I think the most complicated one. The first is inception. So oftentimes the what teams struggle with here is, well, we're losing to long-term benefits. Like short-term benefits, short-term harms are so uncharitable, we're losing to it. But don't forget, right? Long-term outcomes are a result of short-term incremental improvements to a policy. Like you can have, like very simply, you can have no long-term if you don't have short-term. And so what you can explain is, if it starts on the wrong foot, if it starts in a way that it is seen as it is antagonized by the people, that will affect all of the phases and all of the rest of the time the policy will have. And therefore, you can argue it won't be as efficient, you can argue it won't be as effective, you can argue that it will outright, fail and will not happen and will just be a waste of money. Now the second is process. So process is, and I think this is probably the most intuitive one, which is that in order for you to prove an outcome, you need to explain why the process is done well, right? That's why we care so much about actor incentives, because even if they have the capacity to do it well, if we cannot guarantee that for a long period of time it will be done well, then we don't get the outcomes of any of it. The third is outcome. And I think this is just easy to say. It's just the whole you know, inception and process, I guess they're good, but it doesn't define the outcome, right? If the outcome was that it harmed a group of people that we didn't expect it would harm, then that matters independently. And that's why the outcome matters the most. And the last is the longevity. So this is just simply saying, if it's gonna get rolled back in the next 4 years, it probably isn't worth it. You're just wasting billions of dollars. It probably will not help people in the long term anyways. It's a band-aid solution, etc. So that's just like an example of how it looks like. But the general thing is select one of them and explain without why your team really maximizes one of them. So if you're responding, right, I will say the process is terrible. Inherently, it will not work. And then I explain why the process and the fact that it will not work or the fact that it's done poorly affects the other three parts of the timeline. And like this seems very responsive, right? But actually, in order to do this, you need to kind of build and you also need to weigh. So, and if it wasn't clear, right, a lot of the whip building strategies that I just said require building and weighing quite like significantly. And so that's why going back, right, it's important for us to understand what really you can or cannot do at whip. So yeah, that's it. That's the end of my lecture. Thank you so much for listening. And good luck at the tournament.